All right, hello class, and welcome to day 2 of our 1950s culture lesson. In day 1 of our 1950s decade lesson, we learned all about the first two goals that people had during the 1950s. And keep in mind, these are social goals that people wanted during this time. The word social means it had to do with their lives, their culture, the things that were important to them, not necessarily goals with the whole country or goals about the economy or politics. So social goals describes the culture. And the first goal that they wanted was to consume. We talked about consuming new technology in the form of new gadgets and machines they could have in their homes, and then consuming actual food in the form of fast food because people had money and they wanted to spend their money and do their good ideas in the new economy that was doing awesome. Then the second goal we learned was to conform. And we talked about how the people in the 1950s wanted to conform to each other. And what they wanted was everybody wanted to live a perfect life with a perfect family in the perfect house. They wanted to live gender roles. We talked about where the man goes and has a great job, and then the woman stays home and she's a wife and she's a mom and she cooks and cleans. And then we talked about how they wanted to live in suburbia and they wanted to have good, peaceful things happen to them because the last 2 decades of their lives were really hard. And then we talked about how this could be a negative thing to have gender roles and to have the woman and the man feeling like, well, the man had to go to work and the woman had to stay home. And if they didn't do those things, then they weren't doing the goal and they didn't have a perfect life. And so people made them feel bad about it if that's what they didn't want to do. And it's okay to do that if that's what you want to do, but what's hard is when they didn't want to do this. Okay, there's our summary for our lesson from yesterday. And today, the plan is what we're going to learn about the third goal of the 1950s, and then we're going to get into our pop culture. So let's start with our lesson objectives. I can connect the three social goals of the 1950s with the pop culture of that time period. So let's get started. Okay, so I love showing this picture to students because it's so fun. I'm sure you've seen many diners that look like this. This is classic 1950s style. Like I've been telling you the past couple days. The 1950s had a very distinct style. So when you see the checkerboard floor here, and you see pictures of famous celebrities on the wall, and you see the waitress, and you see the style, and then you can basically almost hear the music they're playing in this kind of diner. That is 1950s style. Maybe you've been to Fizz. Fizz kind of looks like this. There's some other restaurants in town that are styled this way. And then maybe you've seen this kind of style in movies and in TV shows. There's a lot of styles that are from the 1950s or take place in diners that look like this. So today we'll learn all about the 1950s pop culture, and boy, is it fun. But first, let's go into our third goal. Our third goal is to be wholesome. Now let's talk about this word wholesome. Being wholesome means that you are basically a nice person that does nice moral things. So this goal has to do with the morality and what the people did and what they didn't do and what was considered right and what was considered wrong in society. So to be wholesome, some other synonyms for that are good or nice or innocent and pure. So if someone is innocent, it's going to mean that they're doing good things, that they're not going to do bad things like be a gangster or do drugs or drink alcohol. That's the kind of thing we're talking about is bad. They're going to do like the opposite of those things. Being wholesome is like, oh, this is the kind of person that your mom is going to tell you to be friends with because they're a good influence as opposed to being a bad influence. Okay, so what this meant is in the third goal, there were moral rules that were imposed by society. So that meant that society was telling the people, everyone, but especially the kids, that they needed to grow up to be good people that were good influences, who were wholesome, who were good, nice, innocent, and pure. So society was saying, if you're not that way, then you're not fulfilling this goal. So you need to be that way, and you need to be a good influence and a good friend and a good person, and then society will like you. That's the kind of messages society was sending to the kids. And so basically it was like, make good choices, don't do bad choices, and society is going to tell you what a good and what a bad choice is. So the question is, well, do we have that in our society today? Well, we do, because if you go to school, your chances are you're going to participate in some kind of don't do drugs program. When I was in 5th grade, it was called the DARE program, and it was something like take a stand against drugs or something like that, and we learned all about drugs and how you shouldn't do them. And so schools and other people like that are, and like adults and other things in kids' lives, are going to teach them how to be good and how to not do bad things and instead do good things. But in 1950s, this was like extreme teaching, and it was like extreme things. So it would be like things like, if you're a woman, then you need to walk upstairs and you need to hold the banister as you walk upstairs, because that's a polite and that's a good thing to do, and that's so wholesome, and that's the way you're supposed to do it. And if you are a kid, you should always say ma'am and sir, and you should always say please and thank you, and you should always ask your parents if you can do anything, and you should always call someone to ask them on a date. If you just ask them on a date, it's not okay. So it was like things like that that were very extreme, and like very little things they would say, oh, you need to do this or you're not being good. So society really had a lot of control of the kids. And just like I said, to summarize, today we have similar things where we teach good kids to make good choices, especially in school, and parents teach you don't do drugs, instead do good things and get good grades. But in the 1950s, they were particular, like what I said about the girl walking up the stairs. And then, so it was very extreme kind of things. So in order to show you an example of this and what I'm talking about, I want you to view video clip number 1. Now, I only show the kids the first couple minutes of it in class when we do it, but you can watch the whole thing if you would like to. You don't have to. It's pretty entertaining if you do. But we only watch maybe the first 4 or 5 minutes, because it gives you a good idea about what we're talking about with this whole be wholesome thing. What this video clip is if you went to school, not only would they teach you don't do drugs like we teach kids today, but they would teach you, here's how you need to talk, and here's how you need to behave with other people. And they would teach you what to say in certain situations if you found yourself influenced by people that were bad people, and how to make good choices. And so this is an example of one of those videos that they would show the kids. So I want you to view it, and I want you to look for, how are they showing the kids to be wholesome? What are they telling the kids to do? And how are they showing you how to be wholesome and what's good and what's bad in society? Now this is a dating video where it's going to be like, here's how you ask a girl on a date. So it's pretty entertaining to watch. But go ahead and pause this video right now and view video clip number 1. Okay, so at this point you should have viewed video clip number 1. I love the clip, especially where the narrator starts talking about why the boy wouldn't like the other kinds of girls. I think it's hysterical. So I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope that you saw how it was very extreme, like extreme to the moment of like, here's how you choose a good girl to go on a date with. And society was like, oh, we need to show our kids this or else they won't choose a good girl of their own accord. And it was like society had to control everything about the kids' lives. Okay, so let's jump into the pop culture, especially right after we've learned the whole be wholesome thing. I bet you can think about how certain teenagers would respond to the 1950s goals. Remember, we have consume, conform, and be wholesome. One thing about being a teenager is sometimes teenagers don't really like to be told what to do. Well, the pop culture at that time period in the 1950s challenged the 1950s goals for perfection. The pop culture said, kids, you don't need to be listening to your parents and to society about what's right and wrong for you. You don't need to live a perfect life. Why don't you do what you want to do? And pop culture gave kids some things in order to challenge these goals for perfection and help them express how they felt about things. Because remember, the ones that wanted perfection were their parents. The parents were the kids of the Great Depression and World War II. They remembered the 2 decades of tragedy where things were really sad, and now they wanted things to be happy and perfect and wonderful. But the kids were saying, well, we don't remember World War II and the Great Depression, and we want to do things the way we want to do them. So why are you telling me what to do? And pop culture was like, yeah, kids, you got the right impression here. So what I want you to do right now is we're going to jump into our first pop culture item. And our first pop culture item for the 1950s was a style of music that came out in the 1950s. And I'm not going to tell you what it is yet because I have a video clip I want you to see, and the video clip will play a classic song from the 1950s that is this style or this genre of music. And I want you to listen to it, and I want you to guess what type of music are you listening to? This is a totally new genre of music that came out in the 1950s. People had never heard songs like this before. So go ahead and pause this video right now and watch video clip number 2. Okay, so do you have an idea about what kind of music video clip number 2 is? What style of music were you listening to? Well, if you said rock and roll, you were correct. You were listening to rock and roll music. It was kind of in the title of the song, so it wasn't too hard to identify that. But your first item of pop culture in the 1950s was rock and roll. This style of music came out in this decade. Before this, people heard things like blues, which then became jazz, and then morphed into rock and roll in the 1950s. And the thing with rock and roll was, it was a very extreme kind of music for that time period. So some of the parents were saying, oh, kids, in order to be wholesome, we can't listen to crazy music like rock and roll. Now, if you think about it, the kind of song I just played for you in video clip number 2 is not even that crazy. But the parents were like, whoa, this is crazy music with a crazy beat. So kids, you got to be careful and not listen to rock and roll. So of course the kids said, yeah, right, we're going to listen to rock and roll because we love it. And your second pop culture item for the 1950s is the biggest star of the 1950s and the biggest star of rock and roll perhaps of all time. I wonder if you can guess who you think this is. Okay, so our second pop culture item of the 1950s and the most famous rock and roll artist of all time is Elvis Presley. So if you wanted to know what rock and roll music sounded like, you listen to Elvis. So what I'll do is I'll tell you a little bit about his background and then we'll listen to some examples of his music. So Elvis Presley is known as the king of rock and roll, or for short, just the king. This was his nickname that he developed. So his music career begins in 1954, so halfway through the 1950s. And just 2 years later, he has a song called Heartbreak Hotel. And that song became the #1 hit in the entire United States of America. Now, that might not seem like a big deal to you, but I want you to think about this. So he starts singing in 1954. No one's heard about him in 1954. And just 2 years later, he has the #1 hit in the entire country. Now, I want you to think about if that was today and he started singing, people loved him and they all loved him immediately at the same time and his music went viral, then maybe like it would happen over a couple days where he would become a household name. But this is not in the time period where things are viral, where people have a lot of access to people's music. What they have to do if they want to hear music is they have to go to like a diner that has a jukebox and they have to request for certain songs to be played in the diner, or they have to actually buy a record from a store and they have to hear the music being played on the record. So or they can also listen to the radio for music as well. So they don't have a lot of access to music like we do today. They can't just put in their AirPods and listen to whatever they want from YouTube. They don't have that instantly available to them. So for Elvis, in just 2 years' time, to go from nobody to then being a household name that everybody knows who he is actually incredible. This means everybody was talking about this guy and everybody wanted to listen to his music. Well, when I say everybody, that was like the kids. It wasn't really the adults because the adults had some problems with Elvis Presley. The adults didn't like two things about him. And I'm going to tell you what those two things were. The first thing they didn't like about him is they didn't like his appearance. They said, oh, boys should not have long hair like Elvis. And Elvis had these huge sideburns, and they said, no, boys need to have clean-shaven faces. And so you can see in his pictures, like if you look at him, he looks clean shaven and he looks like his hair is pretty short compared to what you were used to for long hair for boys today. But back then, it was like super scandalous to have your hair grown out long like Elvis had it. So the parents were saying, no, Elvis is dressed inappropriately and his hair is crazy. And when he'd put on his costumes, they were saying, oh, well, he is too attractive. He shouldn't be wearing his shirt with some open buttons on it, and that's not okay. And then they would talk about Elvis's dancing. Elvis would shake his hips a lot when he was dancing, and they said, oh, that is bad and inappropriate dancing. And you can't look at Elvis. I can't believe he's shaking his hips when he's dancing. And so they said the guy is too crazy and he's inappropriate for children. Well, the children, because they didn't want to be perfect like their parents wanted them to, they said, oh, well, we love Elvis. We like that he's not wholesome like society says you should be. That's a great thing. Now, the second reason the parents didn't like Elvis is because they said that his music sounds like African American music. And so, what this comes from is this comes from a really racist part of America. This is before the Civil Rights Movement, where Martin Luther King Jr. publicized the fact that blacks and whites needed to be equal in society. And so people said it sounds like black music and you should not listen to it. And unfortunately, this is the way that a lot of America felt at that time. And so Elvis, because he was in the South, when he started his career, he toured in the South with a lot of jazz bands, and jazz was something that Black people in the South played a lot of and they knew a lot about. And so Elvis, when he wrote his music for rock and roll, he took a lot of that jazz sound and put it into his songs because he loved it and it was good. It sounded wonderful and it made for really good songs. But a lot of people said, well, we think about that in a racist way. And we don't like that Elvis sounds like people in the South. And so unfortunately, that was what they were told their kids. And they told their kids it was bad because of the way it sounded. And so it would take a couple decades for people to understand that it's okay. We can all listen to the same kind of music and all appreciate it because it's good music. People didn't understand that at that time and they wanted to make it a racist issue instead of just being okay with something that's great no matter where it comes from. Today we know that, but back then they didn't. Okay, so what I have for you is I have two clips of Elvis songs. These are some really good songs, and I want you to hear how he's sounding. Now, I want you to remember how in the previous slide I told you the parents thought he looked crazy and sounded crazy and danced crazy. I want you to look at how he's singing and how he's dancing in the music videos, and I want you to think, how crazy is he really looking here? Okay, so I want you to pause the video right now, and I want you to watch video clip number 3. Okay, so at this point, you should have already watched video clip number 3. Okay, I have video clip number 4 for you. This is another Elvis song I want you to listen to. Go ahead and pause the video right now and listen to video clip number 4. Okay, so at this point you should have watched those 2 music videos by Elvis. Did you see? He was just dancing like a regular person to me. He looked regular, he was dancing regular. The sound didn't sound crazy at all. Can you imagine if those parents from the 1950s saw our music artists today? Can you imagine if they saw a picture of Post Malone or if they saw one of our music artists dancing the way they do today? I think they would have a heart attack and die if they saw that. But for the 1950s, no one had ever done this like Elvis did before. And so people were like, this is crazy and not wholesome. But the kids were like, heck yeah, we like Elvis and we like his music. Okay, so our third pop culture item for the 1950s is a movie. And this movie is called Rebel Without a Cause. Let me tell you a little bit about the background of this movie and the main actor And then what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what the plot of this movie was. We'll watch a trailer and we'll talk about why people liked this movie in the 1930s. Okay, so this movie starred an actor called James Dean. He's the one that you're seeing in these movie posters on the screen right now. He's that one in the red leather jacket. So the movie comes out in the year 1955, when the three goals of the 1950s were in full swing. People knew that society wanted consume, conform, and be wholesome. So James Dean, he was a young and upcoming actor. Before he was in this movie, he was in one movie called East of Eden, and it was pretty successful. People liked it, but then when he was in this movie, he became really, really famous, and people were like, wow, this movie, he did some really good acting. We really like that actor. And then something really tragic happened to James Dean. What happened is he died in a terrible car crash 1 month after the movie was released. And so what this does is sometimes if something happens to a celebrity, then people get really interested in that celebrity, and then they think, oh, well, we need to go and appreciate him by appreciating his work. And so people were like, oh my gosh, did you hear about that tragedy? This super young and attractive guy, he died in the car accident. Let's go see his movie. It's kind of like Paul Walker a little bit. Like more people kind of talked about Paul Walker and James Dean after they died than before they died. And so sometimes that happens when someone's life is open for everyone to see. Anyway, so because of all these things together, because of James Dean and also what the movie had in it, people got really interested in this movie. And let me tell you a little bit about the plot of the movie. Can you see some of the words on the movie poster? Okay, so on the one on the left, it says Warner Brothers challenging drama of today's teenage violence. And then it says James Dean, the bad boy from a good family. And then on the one on the right, I want you to say the very bottom right corner, it says, and they both came from good families. Okay, so what this movie did is it challenged the ideas of teenagers in the 1950s. So like I told you, the parents wanted the teens to live a perfect life in a perfect family with the perfect house. And what happened is people started to say, well, what if our families and our homes aren't perfect? How can we have a perfect life if that happens? Now, the word perfect is kind of a hard word because families come in all different types. But in the 1950s, they said your family needs to be a certain way. A mom, a dad, and the kids are well behaved and great kids. Well, in the movie Rebel Without a Cause, it stars a guy named James Dean. In the movie, his name is Jim. And what happens is James Dean goes to a party with his friends. He's a teenager, and at this party, there was some drinking and alcohol. And then, and this is kind of crazy, and then they were having a car chase, and one of the teenagers drove off a cliff and died in a car accident. It's kind of random, but that's what happens in the movie. Well, Jim goes home and he tells his parents, and his parents say, no, you cannot tell the police about this. You can't get involved because you're a good kid. And they got really mad at him because he was at a party with drinking. Well, and then the movie tells you some other stories about some other teens that don't come from a perfect situation in their family, and how the teens just want to do the right thing, but somehow it becomes a bad situation in their family. Well, and then Jim falls in love with this girl, and that makes his parents upset, and they kind of run away together. And there's more to plot to the story, but that's kind of what I want you to know, is the movie centers on James Dean and the parents and how he just really kind of doesn't get along with them, and they don't understand him, and he doesn't understand them. What this movie did is when people went to the theaters to see this, it really opened their eyes to the fact that sometimes people don't have perfect lives in their family. And the message of the movie was, that's okay. You need to do what you think is right instead of what society is telling you. And Jim, the character in the movie, tried to do what he thought was right when his parents kept saying, no, we need to do what society wants us to do. And so this movie challenged that whole perfection thing. It said, well, you can't realistically do this. And society needs to think about what it's doing. And this movie, for the first time, showed society a teenager. Before the 1950s, the word teenager was not invented. Someone was a child and then suddenly they were an adult. People didn't know about teenagers, and they didn't know there was a middle phase where people were growing into adults, and they weren't kids, but they weren't adults yet. They didn't talk about teenagers before the 1950s. But in the 1950s, with the help of this movie, people started saying, yeah, but what do we do for the teenagers? How do we teach them to have a good life when they're feeling really hard things inside, when they see hard things and society is telling them they need to be a certain way that they don't want to be? And so, for the first time, this movie opened that door where people were saying, we need to think about this and we need to ask ourselves these questions, and we need to stop saying that society gets to tell people what to do, to consume, conform, and be wholesome. And so this movie, of course, the kids were like, "Oh, I totally relate to this. And I totally can see how Jim is having a hard time because I'm having a hard time sometimes." But the parents were saying, "No, don't go see this movie," which made the teenagers want to see it more. All right. So what I want you to do right now is I want you to view the trailer for Rebel Without a Cause. And I want you to see what you see in the trailer. And I want you to look for how Jim doesn't get along with his parents and how the movie is showing you that. And if you are not used to seeing this kind of thing, I want you to picture being in the 1940s and seeing this in a movie and saying, wow, I can't believe it's being so real and so raw right now. So pause this video right now and view video clip number 5. Okay, so you should have viewed video clip number 5 at this point, and I hope you can see how a lot of people seeing that in an actual movie were saying, wow, this is the first time I've seen something that's real, instead of this whole fake thing about consume, conform, be wholesome that society wants us to do. And so what I want you to do is I've taught you at this point the 3 goals of the 1950s. Today, we talked about be wholesome, how the parents were saying, okay, kids, here's all the little tiny things you need to do to be a successful, perfect person. But then the pop culture was saying, yeah, but there's also some fun things you can do. And also, you should be yourself. And you should learn to make your own decisions without society telling you what's okay to do. We learned about rock and roll and Elvis and how they were kind of a little scandalous if you were listening to Elvis and you were looking at his dance moves and his crazy hair. Then we talked about Rebel Without a Cause, where it really challenged that idea of, but what if your family isn't perfect? And why should you have to do things the way that people are telling you if it's not the right thing to do? And in the trailer, you saw where he wanted to go tell the police, but his parents were saying no. And he wanted to do the right thing, but he had to listen to them, but he didn't want to listen to them. And it created a big conflict. So your assignment for today is to talk about, do you think people in the 1950s should have changed any of their goals? And if so, I want you to tell me, how should they have changed them? I want you to think about what you learned about consume, conform, be wholesome. Do you think that they were all perfect the way that that they were for the people? Or do you think they should have been adjusted in some kind of way?